Okay, this is video lecture number 5. This is the last one for the semester for Humanities 2. Um, I want to do a little housekeeping here. It's the last 2 weeks, so this is the last chance to get caught up. And I've left all the assignments up and open. They're all available to do. So if you are behind, you can get caught up. But time is beginning to run short. Please pay attention to the announcement that I made about the pass no pass option, and that holds true for all of your classes, not just mine. So if that's an option you want to take advantage of, all the information you need for that is in the attachment that's in the supplemental materials for you. You can ask me, obviously, but I will probably refer you to admissions or whoever is the um, relevant person on that. Us professors, they tell us these policies, and sometimes we're a little more fuzzy on the details than we ought to be. But it is an option, and I want to make sure you understand that uh, it's GPA neutral. So if you take a pass, no pass option, then what happens in the class will not affect your GPA. So if you're getting a good grade, obviously it'd be something you'd want to go ahead and have registered as a letter grade. But if you're struggling and you still think, well, I just want to pass the class and get credit for the hours, then that's an option. And of course, no pass means you're failing, and anybody who's failing will automatically be put into the no pass category this semester. But once again, it means that you haven't completed the requirements for the course. You can't get the credits for the hours, but the failing grade will not impact your GPA. That's as I understand it. So pay attention to that, and like I said, don't hesitate to take advantage of that. That said, I would rather you work with me and let's get it done, right? That would be also a good option. I will do everything in my power to see to it that everyone who wishes to has a opportunity to pass this class. And I think I've set things up for that pretty well. And that's one of the reasons I've left all of the assignments up and open and available to be done. Um, okay, so lecture time. We've skipped ahead quite a bit in your chapter. We're now, or in your book, we're now on our last chapters for the semester will be on World War II, and I think it's a good place to finish. It's far enough in the past that for most of us it's ancient history, but it's still very relevant, and it's fascinating to realize that this upheaval happened uh, you know, very recently in human history. And this kind of globe-spanning conflict was a new thing in World War One, right? Um, and World War One was so terrible that many people devoted their lives to seeing to it that no such war would ever happen again. And there were a lot of people who had kind of this sort of utopian um, determination that came out of World War One that said, we're never going to allow this to happen again because wars had become so terrible with the new technology and with the new nationalism and with the way that all of these nations were interconnected so that one conflict could spin out of control and uh, encompass the whole world. That was a new thing in World War One. And it's fascinating that between World War One and World War Two, the technology just got better, and the potential for such a war became much more terrible, and yet it happened again almost immediately after World War One, which to me is fascinating. I now have a cat trying to get into the camera wire. Don't go away, go away, get Benji. Um, so uh, that's an enormous failure, and a great deal of pessimism came out of that. The fact that this war had been so bad, and people thought, well, finally, humanity will get past this kind of thing, and because we can't afford to anymore. Well, it turns out we could, and we did. And in many ways, World War II, it's the same cast of characters. It's the same. It's the same in general, uh, and World War II can be seen really as a continuation of World War One. The time between the world wars was kind of halftime, if you will, in that conflict. In the beginning, you have Prussia, which morphs into Germany, and Prussia tries to use the upheaval of the political situations that led to World War One, and they use that as an excuse to make an enormous power grab that ultimately failed. Um, in the aftermath of this, the penalties that Germany suffered were tremendous. And we talked about how when Prussia defeated France for the first time in the 19th century, that Germany imposed an enormous fine and a loss of territory on France, or Prussia did. Well, France and the Allies after World War I had decided that Germany had to pay for this. And the one of the things that won the war for the Allies was the success of their naval blockade that basically cut off all goods from coming into Germany. And the German people towards the end of World War I were starving, literally starving to death. Um, there were food shortages and food riots in the heart of Germany. And that was one of the things that sapped the resolve of the military, was that people back home were literally dying of starvation. And uh, after the armistice and the cessation of hostilities, uh, the Allies kept that blockade in place for another 3 years. And so Germany was utterly devastated. And the fines that were imposed upon Germany by France and by the Allies were ruinous. There was no way they could ever repay them. And within Germany, there was a tremendous amount of upheaval, poverty, social disruption. The government that took over, the Weimar government, they did a terrible job. And one of the things they allowed to happen was massive inflation. When a government begins to just print money, hyperinflation is a huge danger. We may be on the cusp of that in our own situation with the coronavirus and the response to the coronavirus. When a government begins to simply handing people money, what usually happens is a incredible increase in prices and a decrease in the value of money. And so this happened, and hyperinflation got to the point where uh, you could literally, there were people who were bringing wheelbarrows full of printed money to the store, and the amount of money they could carry in the wheelbarrow wasn't worth the price of the wheelbarrow. Things got out of control, and this created a tremendous amount of resentment and a tremendous amount of animosity. And into this comes Adolf Hitler. And in a very short period of time, he restores Germany's pride in itself. He turns the tide in this, and he begins to uh, bring Germany back onto the world stage as a power, and they are pissed off. And his insanity of his hatred of the Jewish people uh, helped drive that. And we all know the horrors that come from that, right? The Holocaust and all the rest of it. But what I want to notice is that um, it wasn't just Germany. This idea of fascism was arising in other places as well. Spain and Italy and Japan. And I think the comparison to Japan is instructive because Japan was so very different from Germany culturally. Uh, but they found themselves natural allies in this world war because the ideology that drove them was very similar. And I want to focus on what fascism is and what defines it. Because Japan and Germany have nothing to do with one another culturally at all. They are on opposite sides of the world, completely different mindsets, different worldviews, different history, and yet the fascism of Imperial Germany and the fascism of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and Spain. Now Spain was a little different. Spain had a fascist government, then they didn't jump in on the side of the Axis, but it was a fascist government nonetheless. Um, so let's look at what some of these characteristics are. Let me pull my notes up here. Um, One of the things that makes a fascist government is this. Part of the overriding thing is this is an enormous tribal mentality, and nationalism, which is devotion to and focus on the identity of your nation, where you know, whether it's Germany or the United States or Italy or wherever, this nationalism that my nation is the best, my people are the best, my ethnic group is the best, um, and we're against everybody else. That's part of what drives fascism. Um, Now, fascists who are nationalists, one of the things they'll say are things like "my country, right or wrong," right? Um, One of the best comeback to that I ever heard in my life was that saying "my country, right or wrong," which means I'm going to stand by my country no matter what they do. And in the United States we have something called American exceptionalism, an idea that America's the best at everything, and people like me will point out, slavery and genocide against the American Indians and things like this, and um, people say, well, you're dishonoring America when you do that, right? When you point out our faults, or you say that we're not perfect, or we're not the best at everything. Um, and that attitude of my country, right or wrong, is kind of what drives that kind of mentality. But um, I think that if you really love something, if you really love your country, for instance, then of course you're going to want to focus on the faults. That really loving something doesn't mean overlooking faults, especially disastrous faults. And so, like I said, the best comeback I've heard against my country, right or wrong, is that's like saying my mother, drunk or sober, right? If you really love your mother, you're not okay with her if she's drunk. You want her to be sober, and you want to do what you can to point out if this is a problem. Um, but fascism really does have that kind of blindness to its own faults, and an insistence that this nation, this country, is the best and can never do anything wrong. Uh, Racism is another feature of fascism, um, that uh, not just my country, but my ethnic group within this country, and that the way that feeds into nationalism is that the goal of fascists oftentimes is to eliminate everyone who isn't in the favored ethnic group, uh, so that the nation now only contains those people. And we see echoes of that. I mean, remember how I said many times in this semester that we know where ideas begin, we never see where they end. It bothers me a great deal when someone, I don't care what side of the political spectrum they're on, when they talk about an upcoming election in this country and say, we need to take our country back. That is a very fascist kind of statement, because it means that all of those other people who didn't vote the way that you would have liked them to, this isn't their country. And unless you regain political power, it's not your country. Um, that's dangerous, I think, because once again, it's built upon this idea of tribalism, of everyone else is outside of my favored group, and they don't count. Um, Absolutism is another facet of fascism. We talked about how Louis XIV was an absolute ruler, right? Someone who had absolute power. And fascists really like to have dictators. Some person who is this godlike figure that they are going to look up to and practically or even just literally worship. They do this a lot. And in the case, Hitler's kind of the poster child for that, but there have been many others. And there are some around even today. Kim Jong-un, whom people are worried is now on his deathbed or has died, which is bad news for North Korea because he's one of these people who is worshipped like a god. And fascism does have that strong man leader, always a man. I don't think there's ever been a female fascist ruler in history. I don't know. There hasn't. Um, and so that's a feature of fascism. Militarism is another feature of fascism. The strengthening the military, making sure the military is as strong as possible, because fascists see threats that need to fight against. Our side is the best, our ethnicity is the best, our country is the best. There are all of these enemies outside or inside that we are fighting against. And uh, so obviously that would lead to we need the best military we can possibly have. And that's what Germany was doing in the breathing space between the world wars, was ramping up their war machine and doing what they could to make sure the next time they took the battlefield, they had the best military available. Um, Hatred is another feature of fascism, and it's about these enemies that fascists are always fighting against. Um, it's that another iteration of that really bad idea that I've talked about throughout the semester. This idea that there are these other people out there that are the source of all of our problems. If we can just eliminate those people, those enemies, then everything will be better. And you see that in our own political world right now, kind of bubbling to the top. Um, People on both sides of the political divide, Democrats and Republicans, are speaking of one another as absolute enemies. Everything will be better if we can just get rid of the Democrats or if we can just get rid of the Republicans. That's a fascist kind of idea percolating to the top. And fear is an incredible motivator. And one of the things these kind of God Emperor leaders of fascist states do is they make sure that their populace is afraid of these enemies and motivated to do whatever they need to do to eliminate them. And the last facet of fascism I want to focus on is this uh, nostalgia for some kind of past golden age, a time when everything was better. And it generally needs to be a time long enough ago that the people who actually lived during that time are either dead or they're very elderly. But there's always this yearning for a golden age in the past, that things have gone to hell and things are terrible, but we were better once. And if we can just get back to what we used to be, then everything's going to be wonderful. And for fascists now in America, it's the stereotypical 1950s of America that they are fascinated by and think that everything was better then. And of course it wasn't. It was better for some people, very few people, but not for a whole lot of others. But that also drives fascism. This idea of if we can just do what we need to do, we'll return to some kind of golden age, some kind of utopia. Um, Now, the thing about fascism is that it fails. It fails universally. Um, when Hitler was at the height of his reign, he was putting together plans for what he called the Thousand-Year Reich. He was building the biggest building. They just begun the foundations of it when the war ended. But he was building the foundation of the biggest building ever made in the history of the world. It was so massive that people who look at the plans of it now think that it probably would have sunk into the ground. Right? There's no way you could put a foundation under something that massive that it would stand up. But his idea was that that would be the center of a new world government, and that his Reich, his revolution, his movement was going to rule the world for at least 1,000 years. Uh, and it lasted about 4 after the outbreak of the war. Um, there are no successful fascist states. They certainly make a lot of noise and do a lot of damage in their time, but they um, fall apart very quickly. And there's a reason for that. Fascists start wars and lose them. And you see it happening. And World War II is probably the best example of this. But were it to happen again in any large-scale way, the same thing would result because there's an internal weakness within fascism, and it's this. Now, remember how I said that one of the ways you can judge a bad idea is by whether or not it has obvious internal contradictions. And fascism has a couple on the very surface. Uh, the first one is this, and the most important one, is that they see their enemies as inferior. Remember, with nationalism and racism, there's this idea we're the best. The Nazis thought that they were a master race. Um, the Japanese thought the same. Um, they're just better, so much better that other people who don't share that ethnicity and that nationalism are not even really human. And the problem with that attitude is that it's combined with fear. So all of our enemies, if I'm a fascist, all of my enemies are inferior to me just by their very nature. They're practically, if not actually, subhuman. Yet, I must be very afraid of them and build up this enormous military might to combat their influence. Those two things do not go together. They're a contradiction. If your enemies are subhuman and inferior, why do you need this massive military, and why are you so afraid of them? Um, Fascists, because they see the world through this distorted lens, are incapable of assessing the strength of their enemies accurately. They don't assess it at all. And this leads to them losing wars. And I can point to some moments. There are three moments, turning points in World War II, where this very thing, the inability of fascists to understand the strengths or even the weaknesses of their enemies, are the turning points in these moments. The first one happens in Stalingrad. Uh, Hitler double-crossed Stalin and invaded Russia, the Soviet Union. And his panzer divisions gobbled up just multiple thousands of square miles of ground very quickly. They annihilated every defensive position they ran into, and they were rolling towards these oil fields in the Caucasus, which are the southern parts of within the Soviet Union. And the plan was to get those oil fields, and Germany desperately needed the oil fields for the conduct of the war. It was one of the reasons that Hitler decided to double-cross Stalin and invade. The Allies were imposing a blockade on Germany that was effective, and it was the same strategy that helped them win World War I. And so Hitler is looking towards the Caucasus as a source of oil. This modern mechanized war machine has to run on fuel. And along the way to that goal was the city of Stalingrad, the city that Stalin had named after himself. And Hitler ordered his forces to stop their advance on the Caucasus and crush Stalingrad. And they felt that this would be easy, and it was at first. They bombed the city into rubble, literally rubble. They bombed the city until there were no buildings left standing. Um, um, no streets were recognizable. And it got to the point where, and of course, lots and lots of civilians and defenders of Stalingrad died in that bombardment. But the problem with bombardments in modern cities is that after a while, everybody who can survive has found a place to survive that isn't bombable. They're underground, or you're in some steel reinforced building, and you're just basically bouncing rubble around after a while without actually taking out any more of the enemy. So they do this, and then they roll in with the panzers. Now the problem is, uh, they bomb the city of rubble, and then try to bring the panzers in. And you can't drive tanks in a city that's been leveled. And so that mistake, that initial mistake, uh, meant that they couldn't bring what was the most powerful part of their war machine to play in Stalingrad. They had to fight it out hand to hand, street by street, building by building. And uh, the assumption was that these Slavic people that were the ethnicity of the Russians were weak and inferior and easily um, dominated. They were inferior to the master race of the Aryan, Nazi ideal. And after bombing the city to complete rubble, and then beginning to clear it out, building by building, street by street, the assumption on the side of the Nazis was that these people would just surrender. What else could they do? It wasn't not in their wildest dreams did they think that someone would keep on fighting. And that's exactly what the defenders of Stalingrad did. And they held on by the by fractions, uh, week after week of this fighting. And Stalin kept pouring more and more reinforcements into the city. There's a famous scene from a movie about Stalingrad called "Enemy at the Gates," um, and it's historically accurate. They are ferrying new soldiers across the Volga. I think the Volga is the river that goes through Stalingrad, and uh, under constant bombardment and strafing from the Luftwaffe, uh, landing fresh soldiers on the banks, handing a clip of ammunition to one and a rifle to the other, and saying, when one man falls, the other one picks up the rifle, and sending them into the city. Um, the carnage was so great, to this very day, if you dig in the ground anywhere in a park or area in Stalingrad, um, you can still find bits of metal and bits of bone. Uh, the Nazis fully expected the city to collapse, and for all intents and purposes, it had. But the people, the defenders, would not stop holding on, and they kept on and kept on and kept on. And every day, Hitler expected to hear that the last forces in Stalingrad had surrendered, and that day never came. And what happened was Hitler poured all of his focus, all of his energy, all of their manpower, all of their armor, all of their air power into defeating Stalingrad. And he kept drawing more and more and more forces and committing more and more men and materials into this meat grinder. And while he was doing that, Stalin was sending fresh troops around the sides of Stalingrad and in behind where the Axis forces were dug in. And they ended up cutting Stalingrad off from the rest of the country. Um, the Germans lost their entire uh, army in that encirclement. They lost all of them. And for over an objective that Hitler did not have to have, right? Over a city that he did not need, was strategically not important. And from that moment, the Nazi war machine gets pushed back, step by step, back out of the Soviet Union, all the way until the fall of Berlin. The Soviets from that moment forward are on the offensive, and the Germans are on the defensive, and they never get their hands on the oil that they need, which ends up at the end with their tanks running out of gas in the Ardennes in the Battle of the Bulge, because Hitler could not accurately estimate the will of his enemy to persevere. For him and for that fascist ideology, that kind of devotion and that kind of sacrifice was impossible. Only the master race could do this. Um, the next moment where this happens is in the Battle of Midway, which is against the Imperial Japan, in our fight against them. Um, And the Imperial Japanese had very much that fascist attitude that they were the best and they were the bravest and they were the only real warriors and everyone else was inferior. And they expected to absolutely crush the Americans. For them, the Americans were soft, they were um, obsessed with entertainment and frivolity, and there was no way that you'd have a culture like Japan with its warrior ethic was just going to walk over these soft Americans. And the Battle of Midway was the turning point. And there was one specific moment in that battle. Um, the Midway Island was a little air base, and the Japanese Navy committed all of their major aircraft carriers to that battle. Um, Midway Island had a small air force there, and they had bombers, and they had some torpedo bombers that were antiquated and slow and easy to shoot down. And what Yamamoto, who was the leader of was the admiral of the Japanese force, what he didn't know was that the United States had 3 aircraft carriers of their own in that fight. Um, he expected to bomb Midway Island into submission, and that would be the end of it. And while the uh, dive bombers from the American carriers were searching for the Japanese fleet, Midway Island kept sending waves of these slow, easily shot down torpedo bombers and bombers against the Japanese carriers and losing them all. Um, and the Japanese are thinking, well, it's a cakewalk. We got this. And there was a moment when one of the fatally crippled American bombers tried to fly his airplane into the command deck of the Kaga, the Japanese flagship. It was a suicide run, and he missed. But there was a moment when all the Japanese naval people on that carrier kind of caught their breath and thought, wait a minute. That was the kind of thing they didn't think an American could do. Uh, they didn't think that kind of self-sacrifice and that kind of bravery and that kind of commitment in a battle was possible for their enemies because their enemies are inferior. And about that time, the American dive bombers showed up over the flight decks of the uh, Japanese carriers, and they lost all but one of them in that fight and never recovered, just like with Stalingrad. From that moment, the Imperial Japanese forces are on the retreat from that moment forward. Um, and then the last one is the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last chance. He saves some really crack troops. He's got some tanks that still have gas in them. He's got some fresh troops nobody knew he had. And when the Allies are marching through France towards Germany, he throws these fresh forces against the strung out American line. And the 101st Airborne gets cut off in a town called Bastogne. It was the coldest winter that anyone had seen in living memory. People were freezing to death at their guns. It was a terrible battle, and the Nazis were bringing panzers against Americans who were fighting it out with very inferior tanks. Our Sherman tanks weren't a match for the Tiger tanks at all, and dwindling ammunition, dwindling supplies, freezing cold. And there was a point where the German commanders are like, we've got this. And the German commanders sent a message to the American troops in Bastogne. This is the text of that letter. It says, to the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. This time, the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. More German armored units have crossed the river. Our near Orthville have taken march and reached St. Hubert by passing through Humfort Street, Libet. Libermont is in German hands. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. In order to think it over, a term of 2 hours will be granted, beginning with the presentation of this note. If this proposal should be rejected, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy AA battalions are ready to annihilate the USA troops in and near Bastogne. The order for firing will be given immediately after this 2-hour term. All the serious civilian losses caused by this artillery fire would not correspond with the well-known American humility. Signed, the German commander. The well-known American humility. Now, it's true that the German forces, had they been on the other side, would have surrendered. The American commander, when they brought the note to him, replied by saying nuts. And that's what they sent back. And the German commanders had to get together and puzzle over what this might mean. And one of them finally translated it as go to hell, which is pretty much what it meant. And then the skies cleared, and our air power began to assert itself, and the German tanks ran out of gas, and they never did get into Bastogne. And so I tell you those 3 stories. It's historical, facts of the World War II, but I think they're illustrative of the weakness that fascism has at its very core, and it's that this idea that everyone is inferior to me is not a great strategy for trying to decide how you should conduct yourself in a combat situation. There's one other contradiction in fascism I want to point out briefly, and that is this. Strangely, fascist leaders are clowns and schmucks, and just the ideal of the fascist superhuman, right? Whether it's Japanese or Italian or anyone else, German, their leaders don't live up to the hype. It's a weird thing. But Hitler's ideal of the Aryan Superman was this tall, blonde, person. Hitler's short. That goofy mustache was his goofy mustache. It wasn't a mustache that was ever fashionable in Germany or anywhere else, ever. He had bad teeth. In our modern times, Kim Jong-un, who is the leader of North Korea, who may be dead now, and that could be problems. But he's a pudgy dude. He's weak looking. He's not. He is not your ideal in terms of your godlike emperor. At some point, the contradiction has to be apparent. Mussolini was a clown. His mannerisms, the way he spoke, the things he said, were just ridiculous. Monty Python did a great skit on this years ago, where they showed basically it was Hitler trying to make a comeback. The setup to the skit was that Hitler had somehow survived the war and was trying to make a comeback by running for a mayor of a small town in Great Britain. And what they did was brilliant. They had John Cleese playing Hitler. And he studied Hitler's mannerism. He was saying the same things Hitler said, and he was gesturing like Hitler did. And it's ridiculous when you look at this. I'll throw some of this up in your supplemental materials so you can see this. And when you take away the adoring millions standing in front of him going, "Sieg Heil," it looks really funny. The way he speaks, the way he moves, his mannerisms are just weird. And I don't know what to say about that. It's a feature of fascism that seems to happen again and again. And that's that. I will, this is the last thing. I guess I'll have a test up for you guys. It'll be shorter. I think we'll do one question and maybe a bonus question. And then we will polish off this semester. You have one more discussion question as well to do. And that's that. I will hopefully we'll get to the end of this. Everybody, I foresee no problems with the mechanics of finishing things up online. But once again, if there's any questions or concerns or anything, please get in touch with me.